All right, so gaslighting. It's everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Arguments, headlines. I feel like I even hear it in, like, every other therapy session.
It's definitely become a bit of a buzzword.
Totally. But that's kind of what makes today's deep dive so interesting, because we're looking at a study, and the title alone is like a plot twist. You ready for this?
Hit me.
It's called The Illusion of Gaslighting.
Okay. See, that's the kind of title that makes you want to know more.
Right. Like, what are they getting at with that?
Well, what grabbed us right away is how it challenges the way we think about gaslighting. So instead of just trying to define it, the researchers wanted to see if what we often call gaslighting is really, actually happening, or if there's something else going on.
It's like, are we really being manipulated, or are our brains kind of tricking us?
In a way, yeah, it's about whether what we perceive as this external manipulation is really coming from our own minds.
And that whole thing about feeling like you're questioning your own sanity, that's scary stuff.
Absolutely. And it's so important to say that the feelings of people who feel gaslighted are completely valid. That confusion, the self-doubt, those are really painful experiences. This isn't about saying those feelings aren't real. It's about understanding them better.
So before we get into the nitty-gritty, can you give us a quick refresher on how gaslighting is usually defined?
Sure. Generally, it's seen as a way of manipulating someone where you try to make them doubt their own version of what's real, their reality.
Like in that play, Gaslight. The husband messing with the lights, making his wife think she's imagining things.
Exactly. A total classic for a reason. But the study, it flips the script. It suggests that what we see as this outside force, someone trying to drive us crazy, might actually be coming from inside, from our own psychology.
So our brains are basically the gaslighter. That's a trip.
It's more like our brains can sometimes misinterpret things, especially under stress or when we're feeling insecure.
Okay, so how do they figure that out? They studied a bunch of people, right?
Yeah, they started with 240 participants, and here's the key. They divided them into two groups. Half of them said they had experienced gaslighting, and the other half hadn't.
Smart. So you've got one group that's primed to spot these manipulation tactics and another that's coming in fresh. What'd they do with them?
They put them through a whole battery of tests. Memory stuff, how flexible their thinking was, how likely they were to be swayed by biases. Oh, and they looked at emotional factors too. Anxiety, depression, that kind of thing.
Right, because our emotions can totally mess with our thinking.
Yeah.
But hold on. They brought actors into this.
They did. And this is where it gets really interesting. They had the participants interact with actors who were following a script. And the thing is, the script wasn't meant to be manipulative at all.
Really? So it was like normal, everyday conversations.
Totally. Like what you might have with a coworker, your partner, a friend. They wanted to see how people reacted to the same interaction, Would people who'd experienced gaslighting see manipulation even if it wasn't really there?
That's such a smart way to test that. So did it work? Did they find what they were looking for?
It was definitely eye-opening. The people who said they'd experienced gaslighting were way more likely to, fall into these thinking traps.
So thinking traps. Okay, you got to explain that.
So remember those memory distortions we talked about? Turns out those are a biggie. People who'd felt gaslighted were way more likely to misremember those interactions with the actors, even when what they remembered didn't actually happen.
You mean they'd remember it in a way that made it seem like the actors were trying to manipulate them, even though they weren't?
Yeah, like their brains were trying to find proof to back up that feeling of being manipulated, even if it meant changing the facts.
So it's almost like our brains turn into these, conspiracy theorists, finding clues to support suspicions, even if the suspicions aren't really true.
That's a great way to put it. And this whole thing, this searching for stuff that confirms what we already believe, that's confirmation bias, and we all do it to some extent.
Yeah, totally. Like when you love a band and they release an album that's kind of meh,
Yeah.
but you only focus on the two good songs because you're a fan.
Exactly. But in this gaslighting context, it can turn into this messed up cycle, You feel gaslighted, so you start looking for anything that proves you're right. And suddenly, totally normal stuff other people do seems suspicious.
That's kind of freaky when you think about it, how our own brains can trip us up like that.
For sure. And there's another piece to this, too. The study also found that the people who said they'd been gaslighted were generally more emotionally sensitive.
More sensitive how?
Like, they had higher levels of anxiety and depression, and that seemed to make them see threats where there weren't any. Even those neutral interactions with the actors, they were more likely to see them as, a personal attack or something.
Oh, wow. So it's like their internal alarm system is always on high alert, so any little thing sets it off.
Exactly. Like, their emotional state is distorting things, making a tiny disagreement into this huge deal.
Okay, now it's all making sense. Our memories are shaky, our emotions mess with our thinking, and if we already think we're being manipulated, we'll probably find evidence for it everywhere, even if it's not real. This is making me rethink a few things, I'm not going to lie.
That's what's so cool about this kind of research. It makes you question what you think you know. But we've only scratched the surface here. Wait till you hear about the interviews. That's where it gets really real.
Okay, spill the tea. What did those interviews tell us about all this gaslighting illusion stuff?
Well, those memory things we were talking about, they were everywhere. Like, people would describe situations where they felt gaslighted, right? But when you compared it to what actually went down, things were different.
So it's not that they were making stuff up, it's more like their memory of it had changed.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, over time, that feeling of being misunderstood, of not being heard, it kind of rewrites the memory itself.
Wild. Do you have a good example of that from the interviews?
Oh, yeah. There's this one that really stuck with me. It was about this couple, and the participant, they talked about how their partner was always denying their memories, contradicting them. Like, they were going crazy.
Ugh, I can imagine. It's so unsettling to feel like your version of reality is constantly being questioned.
Right. But here's where the memory thing comes in. The researchers were smart. They asked if this person had any record of these arguments, like old texts, emails, anything that could back up their side.
Clever. Our memories can be fuzzy, but something in writing, that's harder to argue with.
Exactly. And guess what? Turns out this participant had been keeping a journal. They'd written about these fights right after they happened.
No way. So what happened when they compared the journal to what they remembered?
Okay, so get this. When they actually looked at the journal, their partner wasn't denying things outright. They were just remembering it differently.
So not you're lying, more like, wait, that's not how I remember it.
Exactly. But see, in the participant's mind, it had become this whole thing about being manipulated, even if that wasn't totally accurate.
Wow. This is blowing my mind. So where do we go from here? If our minds are this powerful, if they can shape how we experience something like gaslighting, how do we deal with that?
Honestly, that's the million-dollar question. And it's not about letting anyone off the hook for bad behavior, but it does show how important it is to understand how our own minds work, our biases, our baggage, all of it.
It's more about looking inward than pointing fingers.
100%. Because even if someone feels gaslighted, even if it comes from their own perceptions, it still affects the relationship. Those feelings are real.
So it's hurting the relationship no matter what. Okay, so how do we fix it?
Therapy can be super helpful, and not the kind where you're just trying to figure out who the gaslighter is. This is different.
More about, like, retraining our brains.
Yeah, it's about learning to challenge our own biases, figuring out what triggers us, and just communicating better.
I've heard of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. Does that work for this?
Totally. CBT helps you change those negative thought patterns that mess with you. So with this, it might be like noticing when you're jumping to conclusions, making a big deal out of nothing, or seeing things through like a filter of your own insecurities.
So like telling your brain to chill out and look at the situation for what it really is.
Exactly. And once you can do that, you can start testing those thoughts, right? Looking for other explanations, seeing if your assumptions are actually true.
It's like taking back control,
Yeah.
not letting your fears write the story for you.
Exactly. And it's not just about individual work either. Couples therapy can be huge too. Even if there's no intentional gaslighting, that breakdown in communication, that's real.
So it's about learning to really hear each other, right? To validate each other's experiences, even when they're different.
Totally. It's about building that trust so that both people feel safe, being honest, without feeling judged or shut down.
This has been such an interesting conversation, but before we wrap up, I got to ask, what about boundaries? Like, even if it's my perception, even if it's not intentional, if something feels off, I still need to set boundaries, right?
100%. And that's the tricky part. There's no easy answer. It's a constant process of looking at yourself, being open with your partner, and sometimes, getting some professional help to figure it out.
It's like this deep dive opened up even more questions.
That's what's so great about this stuff, right? It makes you think critically, question everything, and keep learning.
It definitely got the wheels turning. If you're listening and feeling like you just did a brain workout, you're not alone. And hey, learning how your mind works, that's a superpower in itself.
For sure. The more we understand ourselves, the better we can be in our relationships.
And on that note, we're wrapping up our deep dive into gaslighting. It's a wild ride, right? Until next time, keep those brains engaged and remember reality. It's all about perspective.